Okay, so this is a handout that is going to be, I think, particularly useful. It covers a lot of different things that are going to be important regarding quotations. Right now, I'm just going to go through the first 2 pages at most, going through some of the key ideas that are important to take away from this. So I'll get my marker ready. I'm going to read through parts of this. So as you choose quotations for a literary analysis, remember the purpose for quoting. Your paper develops an argument about what the author of the text is doing, how the text works. You use quotations to support this argument. You use quotations to support this argument. That is, you select, present, and discuss materials from the text specifically to prove your point, to make your case in much the same way a lawyer brings evidence before a jury. So to recap, it's there as evidence to support your point. Then they write, quoting for any other purpose is counterproductive. Counterproductive meaning it goes against your purpose, or it is not effective. So do not quote to tell the story or otherwise to convey basic information. So think about that for a second. You're not going to quote to give some plot points. You're not going to quote a passage that, that shows that she was greeted by somebody, right? You don't need to have evidence to support that Renata greeted her. You might have evidence to support a point about how she was greeted. Then you could quote different things. But specific evidence is used to support a point, not to convey plot points or simple things. And then it makes the point, do not quote just for the sake of quoting. Right? I mean, that's pretty obvious. You don't want someone to be reading through what you're writing, looking at a quote and saying that doesn't fit, that's irrelevant. It just, in general, hurts your point. Even if it makes it longer, a lot of times it's just going to make it a lot worse in terms of the overall effectiveness, and then for grading purposes as well, makes it worse. So the handout that we're going to look at provides some general guidelines about using quotations in literary analysis, which is for the most part what we're doing. And then it's going to make some suggestions of way to combine quotes with your own prose. And then there's some nuts and bolts information. We won't get to all of that, but we will get to some of the general guidelines, and I'll point out some things that I want us to be paying attention to. So this is a passage from a literary analysis, we can call it, and I'm going to take us through this, and then I'm going to point to specific things that are going on, and then ask you to point out some things. The actual story does not really matter for our purposes. You don't have to have read it. The specific points we can figure out, but again, those are not the most important thing. We want to see just the relationship of how they're using textual evidence. So it starts, we learn about Mr. Ramsey's personality by observing her feelings about other characters. For example, Mrs. Ramsey has mixed feelings about Mr. Tansley, but her feelings seem to grow more positive over time as she comes to know him better. That's kind of a claim statement that needs to be proven. At first, Mrs. Ramsey finds Mr. Tansley annoying, as shown especially when he mentions that no one is going to the lighthouse. So here, we have a page number. The 52 is a page number, so if we go to that text and on page 52, what do you think we'll find? Okay, so Yeah, wait, say that again? Evidence, yeah, and most likely we're gonna find him mentioning that, that he's annoying, that she finds him annoying, evidence there, and then specifically when he mentions that no one is going to the lighthouse. So that's something from the text that is being paraphrased there. The writer of this paragraph is essentially taking information from the text, thinking it through, and then just explaining it in here, using it as evidence, but not, in this case, quoting directly from it. That's all the writer's own words. But it continues. So, but rather than hating him, at this point she feels pity. She pitied men always as if they lacked something. So in this case, the writer feels like it's necessary to have specific textual evidence, a quotation from the text that supports this idea that she felt pity. So they quoted it directly there, and they put the page number again at the end. Then later, I'm continuing, during the gathering, pity turns to empathy as she realizes that Mr. Tensley feels inferior. He must know, Mr. Ramsey thinks, that no woman would look at him, Mrs. Ramsey thinks, that no woman would look at him with Paul Rayleigh in the room. So again, we have another quote, page number, period. So what I want you to see a couple things going on here. One, that this is integrated right into the sentence. Mrs. Ramsey thinks that, and then the quote goes right in there. So you see how it kind of flows within the text. It's not just a sentence on its own with a quote. It's not just stuck in there. The writer of this paragraph has taken us into that quote, has transitioned into that quote in their own language. Ideally, this is where we want to end up. We want to work through that. So that gives us, I'm not going to go through the entire paragraph now, but that gives us a sense of what it might look like. Just a quick point for what it says down here. It says that it includes three basics kind of material: statements expressing the student's own ideas, data or evidence, and then discussion about how the data supports the writer's interpretation. So we have something that you want to prove. For you, it's going to be mainly your reasons. You can have textual evidence to support that. It could be paraphrased, it could be quoted, and then you have some discussion about how that supports your main point, if necessary. Sometimes it's really obvious, but most of the time it needs something there. Any questions that are coming to mind now related to this in your own work? So I'm going to the next page. Oops. Okay, so I'm going to go through this briefly, and then I'm going to open up for questions and give you a chance to read through it yourself. One point that I will come back to a number of times, hopefully, is the distinction between quoting, summarizing, and paraphrasing. So we need to know what those terms mean. I think many of you do. So when I say quoting, I mean we're taking direct language from the text, we're putting quotation marks around it. When I say paraphrasing, I mean I'm putting it, for lack of a better term, and I'll explain my problem with this phrasing at some point, but you're putting it in your own words, your own rendition of that information, but it's basically the same length as the original. So a paraphrase, if you're paraphrasing something from the book, you're paraphrasing 2 sentences and you write 1.5 sentences to paraphrase, then that becomes a paraphrase. If, however, you're reading 30 pages of the book and you write 3 sentences, that's more likely a summary. You're taking the key points out of it. So you need all 3 of these as you write. One other key point here is make sure to quote selectively. As it points out here, only portions of the text relevant to your point. So you want to cut down quotes so that you're using the minimal amount of language from the quote that's necessary to make your point. If there's like a couple clauses in there that don't fit, that aren't related to your point, cut those out. If they're in the middle of it, if it's a phrase or a clause within the middle of the sentence, you can use what's called an ellipsis, which is a ... which indicates that you're eliminating something out of the text. You're not changing the meaning of it, but you're taking something out so that it allows yourself to only include what is relevant to your point. So one other thing I want to talk about, I'm going to go through here, and then I'm going to let you get back to your work, and then ask me questions. In this handout, it refers to something as an orienter or an introductory phrase. And a lot of times what this does is provide context. So if I write, and I generally do this, I feel like I do this a lot when I'm reading student work related to the novel, I'll write something like need context. Or maybe now I'll say needs orienter. Basically what that is it gives us a sense of where this takes place, or what's the, for lack of a better word now, context for that point. So you want to do this efficiently, so you don't have to include a lot of words for this, but you don't want to just throw something in there and assume the reader knows exactly where that happens in the book. So for instance, if you want to talk about May's conversation with Renata, you might introduce it by saying early on, or almost immediately after entering the circle on her first day, May meets Renata. Renata says, da 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 da, if we want to keep that piece. So you want to provide some orientation for the reader of where these quotes are coming from. You can't just throw us into them. And that's going to be important. It doesn't mean you have to go crazy with summary and providing the whole story. It just means give us something to let us know where this is coming up. Okay. Any questions on this idea, or any questions about quoting at all at this point? Okay. So just a couple things I want to point out. Let's see if I can find a pretty simple one. This is the correct way to do the in-text citation. Just the page number. We know it's coming from the novel, but if we didn't, if you were including other sources, you would put the author's last name. But just the page number here, parentheses, and the period goes after. Not inside the quote, it gets moved outside after the in-text citation. What I do not want you to do, and you want to get out of the habit of this, you should never use the page numbers in the introductory phrase. So you shouldn't say, on page 30, May says this. That's not an orienter. An orienter, or a statement that provides context, will tell us in relation to the story where this happened. But the page numbers do not fit that way. So those just go at the end. You don't want to introduce quotes like that. Another quick point related to the book, and it's not specifically addressed, I don't think, in this handout, is quoting within quotes. And what I mean by that is well, there's a couple different scenarios, but let's say you want to quote something that May says. Don't quote the part, for instance, if the book writes, May said, comma, quote, da 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 da, don't quote the May said part, because that forces you to put quotes around that, double quotes, and then single quotes for what she actually said, and it becomes incredibly confusing. Along the same lines, please don't quote within one of your own quotations two different speakers. So don't say, May said this, quote, Renata responded, and have that be one long quote. Separate those out. Introduce the speakers separately, because otherwise you just make a mess for yourself in terms of putting the right quotation in the right spots, and it just becomes, even if you do it correctly, it just becomes incredibly confusing for the reader. So set those things apart. Take control of the quotes. You're guiding the reader through these quotes and showing them what they're saying. So take control of them by introducing them. It's a skill that's worth developing.